The woman they buried alive. For 11 months, Caleb Rourke stood at his wife's grave every Sunday, mourning a woman the entire town watched drown. But when a forgotten outcast named Mara Doyle whispered four impossible words, "Your wife is alive," everything Caleb believed shattered like glass. Because if Eliza wasn't in that grave, someone powerful had stolen her. And in a territory where land barons controlled everything, the law, the sheriff, even who lived and who disappeared, the truth wasn't just dangerous, it was deadly. If you're ready to uncover what happened to Eliza Rourke, stay with me until the end. And don't forget to hit that like button and comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels. The wind across the Wyoming frontier carried the scent of sage and dust, a smell so constant that most folks stopped noticing it years ago. But Caleb Rourke noticed everything now. Every shadow that moved wrong, every silence that lasted too long, every Sunday morning when he stood alone in the churchyard with his hat in his hands and nothing but questions burning holes through his chest. The grave marker read, Eliza May Rourke, 1851 to 1877, beloved wife, taken by the river, 11 months, 47 Sundays. And not once had Caleb stopped coming. The town of Stillwater Ridge thought he was grieving. They saw a quiet rancher who'd lost his young wife to a flash flood during last year's October storms. A tragedy, sure, but the kind of tragedy the frontier handed out like winter cold. Folks died. Rivers took them. You buried what you could find and moved on. But Caleb hadn't moved on. He stood there every Sunday, staring at that wooden cross. And the longer he stared, the more wrong it all felt. Like a coat that didn't fit right. Like a door left open in a house that should have been locked. Because they'd never found Eliza's body. The search party had combed the riverbanks for 3 days after the storm. They'd found her shawl tangled in the cottonwoods 2 miles downstream. They'd found one of her boots caught against the rocks. But they never found her. The sheriff, a man named Tuttle, who wore his badge like it was made of gold instead of tin, had stood in Caleb's kitchen and said the river must have carried her all the way to the canyon where the current runs deep and fast. Sometimes the land don't give 'em back, Tuttle had said, his voice flat and final. You gotta make peace with that, Rourke. So they'd held a funeral with an empty casket. Caleb had stood beside the grave and listened to the preacher talk about dust and ashes and the mercy of the Almighty, and the whole time he'd felt like he was watching himself from somewhere far away, like his body was there, but his mind had gone walking out into the hills and hadn't come back yet. Now, 11 months later, he was still standing in the same spot, still waiting, still feeling like something essential had been left unfinished. The October sun hung low and orange over the ridge, casting long shadows across the churchyard. Most of the graves here were old, settlers who'd died of fever or childbirth or simple exhaustion from trying to carve a life out of land that didn't want to be carved. Eliza's grave sat near the back, under a juniper tree that twisted up out of the rocky soil like it was trying to escape. Caleb adjusted his hat and was about to turn toward his horse when he heard it. Footsteps. Soft. Hesitant. He turned. A woman stood at the edge of the churchyard, half hidden in the shadow of the fence. She was large, not fat, but solid, the kind of build that came from hard work and harder years. Her dress was plain brown cotton, mended in a dozen places, and her dark hair was pulled back in a braid that hung over one shoulder. She looked to be in her early 20s, but there was something older in her eyes, something careful and watchful. Caleb didn't recognize her, which was strange. Stillwater Ridge wasn't big enough to have strangers. "Help you?" he said, his voice coming out rougher than he'd intended. The woman hesitated. Her hands twisted together in front of her apron, and for a moment Caleb thought she might turn and leave without saying a word. But then she stepped forward into the light, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. "Your wife is alive." The words hit Caleb like a fist to the chest. He stared at her, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to do anything but feel the ground tilt sideways under his boots. "What?" The woman swallowed hard. "Your wife, Eliza Rourke. She didn't drown. She's alive." Caleb's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Who the hell are you?" "My name is Mara Doyle." Her voice trembled slightly, but she didn't back down. "I saw what happened the night of the storm. I saw them pull her out of the river." "Who?" "Two men. They loaded her into a wagon. She was hurt, but she was breathing. Caleb took a step toward her, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat. "You're lying." "I'm not." "Then why didn't you say something 11 months ago?" Mara's jaw tightened. "Because nobody listens to me." "Try me." She looked at him for a long moment, and Caleb saw something flicker across her face. Fear, maybe, or regret, or something darker he couldn't name. Then she glanced over her shoulder as if checking to make sure they were alone. "Not here," she said quietly. "If they see us talking." "Who?" "The men who took her." Caleb's blood went cold. He looked past Mara toward the town, where the main street sat quiet and dusty in the fading light. Stillwater Ridge looked the same as it always did. A handful of buildings clustered around the saloon and the general store, horses tied to hitching posts, a few men standing outside the telegraph office smoking hand-rolled cigarettes. Normal. Peaceful. But if what Mara was saying was true, then nothing about this town was normal. "Come with me," Caleb said, his voice low and hard. "Now." They rode in silence. Caleb led the way on his roan gelding, and Mara followed on foot, her long skirt kicking up dust with every step. He'd offered to let her ride double, but she'd shaken her head and said she was used to walking. Something about the way she said it made Caleb think she'd been doing a lot of things she was used to that nobody should have to get used to. The ranch sat 3 miles outside of town, tucked into a shallow valley where the land flattened out just enough to grow hay and keep a small herd of cattle alive through the winter. It wasn't much, a one-room cabin, a barn that leaned slightly to the left, a corral made of split rails that Caleb had to repair every spring, but it was his. Or it had been his and Eliza's. Now it was just his. He dismounted and tied the horse to the post, then turned to Mara, who stood at the edge of the yard looking like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to come any closer. "Inside," Caleb said. Mara followed him into the cabin. The interior was dim and sparse. A table with 2 chairs, a wood stove, a narrow bed pushed against the far wall. Everything was clean but worn, the kind of place where nothing got wasted and nothing got replaced until it broke beyond fixing. Caleb struck a match and lit the oil lamp on the table, then gestured for Mara to sit. She sat. Caleb remained standing, his arms crossed, his eyes locked on hers. "Talk," he said. Mara took a slow breath, and when she spoke, her voice was quieter than before, like she was afraid the walls might be listening. "I work at the boarding house in town," she said. "I clean rooms, wash linens, cook meals for the miners and drifters who come through. Nobody notices me. I'm just there, like the furniture." Caleb didn't interrupt. "The night of the storm," Mara continued, "I was walking back from the well. It was late, past midnight. The rain was coming down so hard I could barely see, and the river was roaring like a train. I heard shouting near the bridge, so I went to see if someone needed help." She paused, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "That's when I saw them. 2 men, both armed, standing in the water. They were pulling someone, out of the current. At first I thought it was a body, but then I saw her move. She coughed. She was alive." Caleb's chest tightened. "They dragged her up onto the bank," Mara said. "One of them said, 'Get the wagon.' The other one ran off, and a few minutes later a wagon came down the road with no lanterns lit. There was a man sitting up front, an officer, I think. He only had 1 arm." "One arm?" "His left sleeve was pinned up, empty. He didn't get down from the wagon, he just gave orders. 'Load her, keep her quiet, Colonel's waiting.'" Caleb felt something cold and sharp settle into his gut. "They put her in the back of the wagon and covered her with a tarp," Mara said. "Then they drove north, out toward the canyon." "Why didn't you tell anyone?" Mara's eyes dropped to the table. "I tried. I went to the sheriff the next morning. I told him everything I just told you. He looked at me like I was crazy. Said I must have been seeing things in the storm. Said Eliza Rourke drowned, and if I kept spreading lies, I'd find myself in trouble." "Tuttle said that?" "Word for word." Caleb's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. "I didn't know what to do," Mara said quietly. "I'm nobody. I've got no family, no money, no reason for anyone to believe me. So I kept quiet. But I didn't stop watching." "Watching what?" "The patterns." Mara reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. She set it on the table and smoothed it out with her fingers. It was a list of names, 12 names, written in careful, looping handwriting. Caleb leaned closer. Who are they? People who disappeared, Mara said, over the past 3 years. All of them had one thing in common. They stood up to the land company. Grantham and Vale. Yes, Caleb knew the name. Everyone in the territory knew the name. Grantham and Vale was the biggest land company west of the Rockies, buying up homesteads and mining claims faster than the government could survey them. They had money, they had lawyers, and they had a reputation for getting what they wanted, one way or another. What does this have to do with Eliza? Caleb asked. Mara looked up at him, and for the first time since she'd walked into the churchyard, Caleb saw something close to fear in her eyes. Your wife was gathering evidence, Mara said. She was trying to prove that Grantham and Vale was using fraudulent land claims to steal settlers' property. She came to the boarding house twice last year to talk to a man named Pritchard, a surveyor who'd worked for the company and wanted out. He told her everything. Maps, forged deeds, bribes. Caleb felt the floor drop out from under him. Eliza had never said a word. Why didn't she tell me? I don't know, Mara said softly. Maybe she was trying to protect you. Maybe she thought if you didn't know, you'd be safe. Safe from what? Mara's voice dropped to barely more than a whisper. From the same thing that happened to the other 12. Caleb stared at the list of names, his mind racing. You think they're all alive? I don't know, Mara admitted. But I know where they take people when they want them to disappear. Where? There's a camp, north of town, up in the canyon near the old smelter. It's private property, owned by the company. They call it a medical facility. But I've seen the wagons go in and out, always at night, always with armed guards. Caleb's hands were shaking now, and he pressed them flat against the table to steady himself. If Eliza's alive, he said slowly, why haven't they killed her? Mara met his eyes, and her expression was grim. Because they need to know what she told other people first. The silence that followed was heavy and absolute. Caleb turned away from the table and walked to the window, staring out at the darkening hills. His mind was a storm of thoughts, questions, possibilities, all of them sharp and cutting and impossible to hold on to. Eliza was alive. The grave he'd been standing at for 11 months was empty, and the people he'd trusted, the sheriff, the town, maybe even some of his neighbors, had either helped bury the truth or been too blind to see it. Why are you telling me this now? Caleb asked without turning around. Because I can't carry it alone anymore, Mara said. And because if we don't do something soon, they're going to kill her. Caleb turned back to face her. How do you know? I overheard 2 of the company's men talking at the boarding house last week. They said the interrogation was almost finished, that the colonel was losing patience. Caleb's blood went ice cold. How long? I don't know. Days, maybe. A week at most. He stood there for a long moment, staring at this woman he didn't know, this stranger who'd walked into his life with a truth so impossible it felt like fiction. But it wasn't fiction. He could see it in her eyes, the weight of it, the burden of carrying a secret nobody else wanted to hear. What do you want from me? Caleb asked. Mara's voice was steady, but there was a tremor beneath it, like the ground before an earthquake. I want you to help me get her out. They talked until the oil lamp burned low, and the night turned cold enough to see their breath in the air. Mara told Caleb everything she'd learned over the past 11 months, every scrap of information, every overheard conversation, every pattern she'd noticed in the comings and goings of the company's men. The camp in the canyon was real. She'd seen it herself, hiking up through the rocks one afternoon when the guards were distracted. It was surrounded by a high fence, with a gate that stayed locked and a single road leading in. There were buildings inside, wooden structures that looked like barracks, and one larger building made of stone that had bars on the windows. That's where they keep them, Mara said. The ones they don't want anyone to find. How many guards? At least 6, maybe more. Caleb rubbed a hand over his face, exhaustion and anger battling for control. We can't just walk in there, he said. I know. And we can't go to the sheriff. No. So what do we do? Mara was quiet for a moment, then she reached into her apron again and pulled out another piece of paper, this one folded smaller, worn at the edges like it had been carried for a long time. She set it on the table. Caleb picked it up and unfolded it. It was an official-looking document typed on company letterhead with a signature at the bottom that was barely legible. The words at the top made his stomach turn. Authorization for temporary detention. Subject: Eliza May Rourke. Reason: suspected espionage and theft of proprietary information. Duration: indefinite. Authorized by Colonel Victor Harrow, Chief of Security, Grantham and Vale Land Company. Caleb read it twice, then looked up at Mara. "Where did you get this?" "I stole it," Mara said simply. "From the telegraph office. The operator leaves the files unlocked when he goes to lunch." "This is proof." "Not enough," Mara said. "It doesn't prove she's still alive, and it doesn't prove the company broke the law. They'll say it was all legal, that they had the authority to detain her for questioning." "Did they?" "I don't know, but I know someone who might." "Who?" "There's a lawyer in Cheyenne, a man named Aldrich. He used to work for the company, but he left last year after they tried to make him forge documents. He's been trying to expose them ever since, but no one will listen." Caleb folded the paper and slid it into his shirt pocket. "How do we reach him?" "Telegraph. But we can't send it from Stillwater Ridge. The operator reports everything to the company. Then we go to the next town. That's 50 miles. Then we start riding at first light." Mara stared at him, and for the first time since she'd walked into the churchyard, something close to hope flickered across her face. "You believe me," she said quietly. "I believe my wife didn't drown," Caleb said. "And I believe someone's been lying to me for 11 months. That's enough." Mara nodded, and then she stood, brushing the dust from her skirt. "I should go," she said. "If I'm not back at the boarding house by morning, they'll notice." "You're not going back?" Mara blinked. "What?" "If they find out you've been talking to me, you're dead," Caleb said flatly. "You stay here tonight. Tomorrow we ride to Pine Bluff and send that telegram. After that, we figure out how to get Eliza out of that camp." Mara opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. She looked around the small cabin, at the bed in the corner, at the cold stove and the empty chairs. "Where will I sleep?" she asked. "Take the bed," Caleb said. "I'll sleep in the barn." "You don't have to. I'm not arguing about it." Mara hesitated, then nodded. Caleb grabbed his coat from the hook by the door and turned to leave, but before he stepped outside, he paused and looked back at her. "Why?" he asked. "Why what? Why did you risk everything to tell me the truth?" Mara was quiet for a long moment, and when she finally spoke, her voice was so soft Caleb almost didn't hear it. "Because nobody else would." Caleb didn't sleep. He lay on a pile of hay in the barn, staring up at the rafters, listening to the wind rattle the loose boards and the horses shift in their stalls. His mind wouldn't stop racing. Images of Eliza's face, the sound of her laugh, the way she used to hum while she kneaded bread dough in the mornings. He thought about the grave he'd stood at for 11 months. He thought about the sheriff's flat, dismissive voice. He thought about the one-armed colonel and the authorization for detention and the 12 names on Mara's list. And he thought about the question that had been burning in his chest since the moment Mara spoke those 4 impossible words. If Eliza was alive, why hadn't she tried to escape? Why hadn't she sent word? Why hadn't she fought? The answer, when it came to him, was worse than anything he'd imagined. Because she couldn't. Because they'd broken her. Or they were trying to. Caleb sat up, his jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists. He'd spent 11 months standing at an empty grave, mourning a woman who wasn't dead. He'd let them bury the truth. He'd let them win. Not anymore. He stood, brushed the hay from his clothes, and walked out into the cold night air. The stars were sharp and bright overhead, scattered across the sky like broken glass. Somewhere out there, beyond the hills and the canyon and the high fence with the locked gate, Eliza was waiting. And Caleb was going to bring her home, even if it killed him. Dawn came cold and gray, the kind of morning where the sun barely bothered to show itself behind the clouds. Caleb stood in the yard, saddling his horse while Mara waited by the fence, her arms wrapped around herself against the chill. She'd tied her hair back with a strip of cloth and changed into a riding skirt she'd borrowed from the trunk in the cabin, one of Eliza's old ones that Caleb hadn't been able to bring himself to give away. Seeing it on another woman should have bothered him, but it didn't. There wasn't room for that kind of sentiment anymore. You ever ridden before? Caleb asked, tightening the cinch on the saddle. A few times, Mara said, when I was younger. Good enough. We've got 50 miles to cover and no time to waste. He'd saddled Eliza's mare, a gentle bay named Rosie, who hadn't been ridden in almost a year. The horse had grown soft from standing in the pasture, but she was steady, and that's what mattered. Caleb helped Mara into the saddle, then swung up onto his own gelding. They rode out as the first light touched the hills, heading east toward Pine Bluff. The land stretched out before them in rolling waves of brown grass and scattered juniper, empty and vast and indifferent to whatever small human dramas played out beneath its sky. Caleb kept the pace steady, but not punishing, watching Mara out of the corner of his eye to make sure she could handle it. She rode like someone who'd learned out of necessity rather than pleasure, her posture stiff, her hands gripping the reins too tight. But she didn't complain. She just kept her eyes forward and her mouth shut, and Caleb found himself respecting that. They didn't talk much for the first hour. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, just careful, like two people walking on ice that might crack if they moved too fast. But as the sun climbed higher and the land opened up into wider country, Caleb found himself breaking it. You said you've been watching the company for 11 months, he said. What made you start? Mara was quiet for a moment, her eyes on the horizon. I saw what they did to a man named Pritchard, she said finally. The surveyor I told you about. He came to the boarding house to meet your wife, but he also came to hide. He was scared. Said the company knew he'd been talking, and it was only a matter of time before they came for him. What happened to him? He disappeared 3 days after Eliza did. I went to his room to bring him breakfast, and the door was open. Everything was gone. His clothes, his papers, even the bed linens, like he'd never been there at all. Caleb's jaw tightened. I asked the landlady about it, Mara continued. She said Pritchard had left in the night without paying, but I didn't believe her. I'd seen the fear in his eyes. That wasn't a man planning to skip out on rent. That was a man who knew he was being hunted. So you started looking into it. I didn't know what else to do. Nobody was asking questions. Nobody cared. So I started paying attention. Who came and went? Who talked to who? What the men at the company said when they thought no one was listening. And they never noticed you. Mara's mouth twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. Nobody ever notices me, she said. I'm just the girl who cleans the rooms and brings the food. I'm furniture, a shadow. It's like I don't exist. There was no self-pity in her voice, just a flat statement of fact, and that made it worse somehow. Well, you exist now, Caleb said. Mara looked over at him, and for a moment something flickered in her eyes, surprise maybe, or gratitude, but she didn't say anything. She just nodded and turned her attention back to the road. They rode on. By midday, they'd covered half the distance to Pine Bluff, and Caleb called a halt near a narrow creek that cut through the scrubland. The horses needed water, and so did they. Mara dismounted stiffly, wincing as her legs took her weight, and walked to the creek to splash cold water on her face. Caleb let the horses drink, then pulled a canteen and a cloth-wrapped bundle of bread and dried beef from his saddlebag. He handed half to Mara, and they sat on a flat rock near the water, eating in silence while the wind moved through the grass like something alive. How long were you married? Mara asked after a while. 3 years. Where did you meet her? Caleb chewed slowly, remembering. Kansas, he said. I was working as a ranch hand, and she was teaching at a schoolhouse in a town called Cedar Falls. I met her at a church social. She was trying to get the children to sing a hymn, and they were doing everything but. I thought she was going to give up and walk out, but she didn't. She just kept going, patient as stone, until they got it right. What made you talk to her? I didn't. She talked to me, asked if I knew anything about fixing a broken window latch in the schoolhouse. I said I did, and she said, Good. Come by tomorrow, and I'll pay you in pie. So I did. Mara smiled faintly. And? Best pie I ever had. Married her 6 months later. She sounds strong. She is. Mara looked at him, and Caleb realized what he'd said. Is, not was, because Eliza wasn't dead. She was out there, somewhere in that camp, waiting for someone to come for her. And he would. He crumpled the cloth and shoved it back into the saddlebag, then stood and brushed the crumbs from his pants. We should keep moving, he said. Mara nodded and rose to her feet, and they mounted up again and rode on through the long afternoon. Pine Bluff was bigger than Stillwater Ridge, but not by much. It sat at the junction of two wagon roads, a dusty collection of buildings built around a single main street that ran straight as a ruler for a quarter-mile before petering out into open range. There was a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and a telegraph office with faded yellow paint and a sagging porch. Caleb and Mara tied their horses outside the telegraph office just as the sun was starting to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Caleb pulled the folded authorization paper from his pocket and smoothed it out, checking it one more time before they went inside. "Let me do the talking," he said. Mara nodded. The interior of the telegraph office was dim and smelled like old paper and tobacco. A clerk sat behind a scarred wooden counter, a balding man in his 50s with spectacles perched on the end of his nose. He looked up as they entered, his expression neutral. "Help you?" he said. "Need to send a telegram," Caleb said. "Where to?" "Cheyenne. Man named Aldrich. He's a lawyer." The clerk pulled a blank form from a drawer and slid it across the counter along with a pencil. "Write it out. 10 cents a word." Caleb picked up the pencil and paused, thinking. He needed to say enough to get Aldrich's attention, but not so much that it would raise suspicion if the wrong person saw it. He wrote carefully, keeping his handwriting neat and his message short. Aldrich, stop. Have evidence of illegal detention by Grantham Vale. Stop. Wife held without trial. Stop. Need legal counsel. Urgent. Stop. Will pay. Stop. Rourke. He slid the paper back across the counter. The clerk read it, his face betraying nothing, then counted the words with the tip of his pencil. 18 words? $1.80? Caleb pulled 2 silver dollars from his pocket and set them on the counter. The clerk took them, made change, and began tapping out the message on the telegraph key. The clicks filled the small room, sharp and rhythmic, like a mechanical heartbeat. When he finished, the clerk tore off a receipt and handed it to Caleb. "Should get a reply within a day or two, if he's in town," the clerk said. "You want me to hold it here or send it to Stillwater Ridge?" "Hold it here," Caleb said. "I'll come back." The clerk shrugged. "Suit yourself." Caleb folded the receipt and pocketed it, then turned to leave. But as he reached the door, the clerk spoke again. "You're the one from Stillwater Ridge, aren't you? The rancher whose wife drowned last year." Caleb stopped, his hand on the doorframe. "That's right." The clerk studied him for a moment, his eyes unreadable behind the spectacles. "Funny thing," he said slowly. "I heard she drowned, but you're sending telegrams about illegal detention." Caleb turned back, his voice flat and cold. "You heard wrong." The clerk held his gaze for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Reckon I did," he said. Caleb walked out, Mara close behind him, and they didn't speak until they were back on their horses and riding out of town. "You think he'll talk?" Mara asked quietly. "Probably," Caleb said. "But it doesn't matter. We're not hiding anymore." They made camp that night in a shallow draw a few miles west of Pine Bluff, where the land dipped low enough to hide the light of a fire from anyone riding the main road. Caleb gathered dry brush and built a small blaze while Mara unsaddled the horses and set them to grazing on a long tether. The fire crackled and popped, sending sparks up into the darkness. Caleb sat with his back against his saddle, staring into the flames, while Mara wrapped herself in a blanket and sat across from him, her face shadowed and thoughtful. "What do you think Aldrich will say?" she asked. "I don't know," Caleb admitted. "But if he's been trying to expose the company, he'll want to see that authorization. It's proof they've been breaking the law." "Is it enough?" "It has to be." Mara was quiet for a moment. Then she looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "What if we can't get her out?" she said softly. "What if the company moves her before we can act? What if—" "Don't," Caleb said, his voice sharp. "Don't start thinking like that. I'm just trying to be realistic. Realistic is what gets people to stop fighting. I'm not stopping." Mara nodded slowly, then pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Tell me about her," she said. "About Eliza. What was she like?" Caleb was silent for a long time, staring into the fire, and when he finally spoke, his voice was softer than it had been all day. "She was stubborn," he said, "strong-willed, the kind of person who, once she made up her mind about something, You couldn't talk her out of it even if you wanted to. She believed people should do what's right, not what's easy, and she didn't care if that made her unpopular. Sounds like she'd fit right in on the frontier. She did. Better than me, sometimes. I'm the kind of man who keeps his head down and minds his own business. Eliza wasn't like that. If she saw something wrong, she spoke up, even when it would have been smarter to stay quiet. Is that why she went after the company? Probably. She heard about families losing their land to fraudulent claims, and she couldn't let it go. She started asking questions, talking to people, putting pieces together. I told her to be careful, but she said someone had to do something. Caleb's throat tightened, and he had to stop for a moment. I should have listened closer, he said quietly. I should have seen what she was walking into. You couldn't have known. I should have. Mara didn't argue. She just sat there, watching him across the fire. And after a while she spoke again. She's lucky to have you. She doesn't have me yet, but she will. Caleb looked up at her, and for the first time since this whole thing started, he felt something close to hope stir in his chest. Yeah, he said, she will. They rode back to the ranch the next day, arriving just as the afternoon light was beginning to fade. Caleb's mind was already turning over the next steps. Wait for Aldrich's reply, gather more evidence, figure out a way to get close to the camp without getting killed. But as they crested the rise that overlooked the valley, Mara suddenly pulled her horse to a stop. Wait, she said, her voice tight. Caleb turned. What? She pointed toward the ranch. Caleb's blood went cold. There were horses tied to the fence, 4 of them. And standing in front of the cabin were 3 men, all of them armed, all of them watching the road. Waiting. Caleb's hand moved instinctively to the rifle strapped to his saddle, but Mara grabbed his arm. Don't, she said. If you ride in there, guns out, they'll kill you. Then what do you suggest? Let me go first. Alone. I'll tell them I came to clean the place. You stay back and watch. If they try anything, you'll know. Caleb wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. If the company's men saw him coming, they'd assume he knew something, but a woman on her own, someone they'd already dismissed as harmless, she might be able to walk right past them. Be careful, he said. Mara nodded, then urged her horse forward down the slope. Caleb stayed on the ridge, dismounting and crouching low behind a stand of rocks where he could see the yard without being seen. He pulled the rifle from its scabbard and checked the load, his heart pounding in his chest. Below, Mara rode into the yard, her posture calm, her face neutral. One of the men stepped forward, a tall, lean figure in a dark coat with a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his eyes. He raised a hand and Mara stopped. Caleb couldn't hear what they were saying, but he watched the man's body language, the way his hand hovered near his belt, where a pistol hung in a worn holster. The other 2 men flanked him, watching Mara with the kind of casual menace that came from men who knew they had the upper hand. Mara said something, gesturing toward the cabin, and the tall man shook his head. He spoke again, his voice carrying just enough for Caleb to catch a few words. Looking for Rourke. Questions. Mara shook her head, her hands open and empty, her voice too quiet for Caleb to hear. The man studied her for a long moment, then turned and said something to the other 2. One of them laughed. Caleb's finger tightened on the trigger. Then the tall man waved Mara off, dismissing her like she was nothing, and turned back to the cabin. Mara hesitated for just a second, then turned her horse and rode slowly back up the road, her face pale but composed. Caleb waited until she was out of sight of the men before rising from his hiding spot and moving to intercept her. When she saw him, she had slid down from the saddle, her legs shaking. They're looking for you, she said, her voice tight. They know you went to Pine Bluff. How? The telegraph clerk must have talked. They said the company wants to ask you some questions about the message you sent to Aldrich. Caleb cursed under his breath. Did they hurt you? No, they didn't even recognize me, just told me to move along and stay out of their business. What do they want? You. They're going to wait until you come back, and then they're going to take you to the camp. Caleb looked down at the ranch, at the men standing in his yard like they owned it, and something hard and cold settled into his chest. Let them wait, he said. What are you going to do? What I should have done 11 months ago. I'm going to stop hiding. Mara stared at him. If you go down there, they'll arrest you, or worse. Maybe, but I'm done running. And I'm done letting them think they can take whatever they want. He checked the rifle one more time, then swung back into the saddle. Caleb, wait! But he was already moving, riding down the slope toward the ranch with his rifle across his lap and his eyes locked on the men in his yard. The tall man saw him coming and stepped away from the cabin, his hand dropping to his pistol. The other two fanned out, their movements practiced and deliberate. They'd done this before. Caleb reined in 20 feet from the fence and sat there, letting them see him, letting them see the rifle. "Help you, gentlemen?" he said, his voice flat. The tall man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Caleb Rourke?" "That's right." "Name's Dougherty. I work for Grantham and Vale. We'd like to ask you a few questions." "Ask them from where you're standing." Dougherty's smile widened. "See, that's not how this works. You sent a telegram to a lawyer in Cheyenne making some pretty serious accusations about my employer. Now, we figure that's either a misunderstanding or you've been listening to the wrong people. Either way, we'd like to clear it up." "There's nothing to clear up." "Then you won't mind coming with us?" "I'm not going anywhere." Dougherty's hand moved a fraction closer to his pistol. "That wasn't a request, Rourke." Caleb shifted the rifle slightly, just enough to make it clear what would happen if Dougherty drew. "And this isn't a negotiation," Caleb said. "You're standing on my land. You've got no warrant, no legal authority, and no reason to be here. So you can either turn around and ride out, or you can try something stupid and see what happens." For a long moment, nobody moved. The wind pushed through the valley, rattling the fence posts and stirring up dust. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called. Then Dougherty laughed, a low, humorless sound. "You're making a mistake, Rourke." "Wouldn't be the first time." Dougherty stared at him, his eyes cold and calculating, and Caleb could see him weighing the odds. 3 men against 1, but the one had a rifle, and the high ground and nothing left to lose. Finally, Dougherty stepped back and nodded to the other two. "Let's go," he said. They mounted their horses without another word and rode out, but as Dougherty passed, he looked back at Caleb one more time. "This isn't over," he said. "I know," Caleb said. And then they were gone, disappearing into the dust and the fading light. Caleb sat there for a long time, his hand still gripping the rifle, his heart hammering in his chest. Finally, he dismounted and walked to the cabin, his legs unsteady beneath him. Mara was waiting by the fence, her face pale. "You're insane," she said. "Probably. They'll come back. And next time they'll bring more men." "I know. So what are we going to do?" Caleb looked at her, and then he looked out at the hills, at the canyon, somewhere beyond them where Eliza was waiting. "We're going to stop waiting for permission," he said. "We're going to find proof that'll bury them. And then we're going to get her out." Mara's eyes widened. "How?" Caleb pulled the folded authorization from his pocket and held it up. "This says the detention was authorized by Colonel Harrow, but it doesn't say under what law. If we can prove the law they used doesn't exist anymore, or that they violated it, then everything they've done becomes kidnapping. How do we prove that? We find someone who knows the law, someone the company can't touch. Aldrich. If he replies, but we can't wait for that. We need more evidence. Something that connects the camp to the missing 12. Something that proves Eliza and the others are being held illegally." Mara was quiet for a moment, thinking. "The telegraph operator in Stillwater Ridge keeps records of every message that goes through the office," she said slowly. "If the company's been coordinating detentions by wire, there'll be a paper trail. Can you get to it?" "Maybe. He leaves the office unlocked when he goes to the saloon at night." Caleb looked at her, and for the first time in 11 months, he felt like he was moving forward instead of standing still. "Then that's where we start," he said. They waited until full dark before riding back into Stillwater Ridge. The town sat quiet under a cold moon, most of the buildings already shuttered for the night. Only the saloon showed any light, a warm yellow glow spilling out through the windows, and the sound of rough voices and a badly tuned piano drifting on the wind. Caleb and Mara stayed on the edge of town, keeping to the shadows behind the livery stable. From there they could see the telegraph office across the street, its windows dark, its door closed. The operator, a thin, nervous man named Jessup, who'd worked for the company longer than anyone could remember, would be at the saloon by now, nursing his third whiskey and complaining about his rheumatism to anyone who'd listen. "How long does he usually stay?" Caleb asked quietly. "An hour, sometimes 2 if someone buys him a drink. That's not much time." "It'll have to be enough." Caleb studied the street, looking for movement, for anything that seemed out of place. The company's men had been at his ranch just hours ago. They knew he'd sent a telegram. They'd be watching. But the street was empty. "Stay with the horses," Caleb said. "If anyone comes, you ride hard and don't look back." Mara shook her head. "I'm going with you." Mara, I know where the files are kept. You don't. And if Jessup comes back early, he won't be surprised to see me. He's used to me being invisible." Caleb wanted to argue, but she was right. He nodded once, then dismounted and tied his horse to a post in the shadows. Mara did the same, and together they crossed the street, moving quickly but not running, just 2 people with somewhere to be and no reason to hide it. The telegraph office door was locked, but Mara produced a thin piece of wire from her pocket and worked it into the mechanism with practiced ease. The lock clicked open, and they slipped inside, closing the door behind them. The interior was pitch black and smelled like ink and old paper. Caleb stood still, letting his eyes adjust, while Mara moved through the darkness with the confidence of someone who'd been here before. He heard her footsteps, the soft scrape of a drawer opening, the rustle of papers. "Here," she whispered. Caleb moved toward her voice and found her kneeling beside a wooden filing cabinet, its drawers pulled open. She'd lit a match and was holding it close to a stack of papers, her face illuminated in the flickering light. "What are we looking for?" Caleb asked. "Anything addressed to or from Colonel Harrow. Anything about detentions, transfers, or medical facilities. Anything that doesn't make sense." They worked quickly, sorting through months of telegraph records while the match burned down and Mara lit another. Most of the messages were mundane: orders for supplies, reports on livestock sales, routine correspondence between the company's offices. But then Caleb found something that made his blood run cold. It was a message dated 2 weeks after Eliza's disappearance, sent from Stillwater Ridge to the company's headquarters in Denver. Subject secured stop, interrogation ongoing stop, requesting authorization for permanent resolution. If cooperation fails, stop. Harrow. Caleb's hand shook as he held the paper up to the light. "Look at this," he said. Mara leaned closer, reading quickly, and her face went pale. "Permanent resolution," she whispered. "They were going to kill her." "Were. Past tense, which means she cooperated. Or they think she did." Mara flipped through more papers, her movements frantic now, and pulled out another message. This one dated 3 months ago. Subject still refusing full disclosure, stop. Recommend extended detention, stop. Additional subjects may hold relevant information. Stop. Will compile list. Stop. Harrow. "Additional subjects," Caleb said quietly. "The other 12. Mara nodded, then kept searching. She found more messages, each one colder and more clinical than the last. Requests for medical supplies, reports on interrogation progress, orders to increase security at the Canyon facility. And then, buried near the bottom of the stack, a message that changed everything. It was dated 6 years ago, sent from the Territorial Governor's Office to all land companies operating in Wyoming. Notice to all parties. Stop detention. Authority granted under Emergency Land Protection Act hereby expires, effective immediately. Stop. All detentions must cease. Stop. All prisoners released. Stop. Failure to comply will result in criminal prosecution. Stop. Governor's Office. Caleb read it twice, his mind racing. "The law expired," he said, 6 years ago. Every person they've detained since then has been held illegally." Mara stared at the paper, her eyes wide. "They knew," she said. "They had to know. This went out to every company in the territory. They didn't care. They kept doing it anyway because nobody was watching. Nobody was asking questions." Caleb folded the message and slid it into his pocket along with the others. He was about to close the drawer when Mara grabbed his arm. "Wait," she said. "Listen." Caleb froze. Footsteps. Outside on the boardwalk. Coming closer. Mara blew out the match, and they both dropped low behind the counter, hearts pounding in the darkness. The footsteps stopped at the door. There was a pause, then the sound of a key sliding into the lock. Jessup. The door swung open and lamplight flooded the room. The telegraph operator stepped inside, muttering to himself, a bottle of whiskey tucked under one arm. He set the lamp on the counter and turned toward the filing cabinet, and stopped. The drawers were still open. Papers scattered across the floor. Jessup's hand moved toward his belt, but before he could draw whatever weapon he kept there, Caleb rose from behind the counter with his rifle leveled at the man's chest. "Don't," Caleb said quietly. Jessup went pale. His hand froze. "Rourke," he said, his voice shaking, "what the hell are you doing?" "Looking for the truth. Seems like you've been helping the company bury it for years." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Then why did you tell them I sent a telegram to Aldrich?" Jessup's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Mara stood up from behind the counter, and when Jessup saw her, his eyes widened. "You," he said, "you're the one who's been stealing my files." "I didn't steal anything," Mara said evenly. "I just borrowed them long enough to learn the truth. The company's going to kill you both for this." "Maybe," Caleb said, "but before they do, you're going to answer some questions." Jessup shook his head frantically. "I can't. They'll—" Caleb took a step closer, the rifle still steady. "How many messages have you sent for Harrow in the past year?" "I don't keep count." "Try." "Dozens, maybe more. I don't ask questions. I just send the wires." "And you never wondered what permanent resolution meant? Or why people kept disappearing after you sent messages about them?" Jessup's face crumpled. "I needed the work. The company pays me triple for handling their wires. I got a wife and 2 kids in Denver. I can't afford to lose this job." "So you helped them kidnap innocent people?" "I didn't kidnap anyone. I just sent the telegrams." Caleb's voice dropped to a whisper, cold and hard. "My wife is in that camp because of you. 12 other people are missing because of you. You want to keep pretending you didn't know what you were doing? That's your choice. But it won't save you when the law comes asking questions." Jessup's legs gave out and he sank into a chair, his face in his hands. "What do you want from me?" he said, his voice muffled. "Copies of every message Harrow sent in the past 3 years. Every single one. That's hundreds of pages." "Then you better start copying." Jessup looked up, his eyes red and watery. "If I do this, the company will know. They'll come for me." "They're already coming for you," Mara said quietly. "You think they're going to let you keep working once this all comes out? You think they're going to protect a telegraph operator when federal marshals start asking questions?" Jessup stared at her, and Caleb could see the moment the truth landed. The man's shoulders sagged, and he nodded slowly. "How long do I have?" he asked. "All night," Caleb said. "We'll wait." Jessup worked through the night, his hand cramped and shaking, copying message after message by lamplight while Caleb and Mara kept watch. Every sound outside made Caleb's hand move to his rifle. Every shadow passing the window made his heart jump. But the town stayed quiet. By dawn, Jessup had filled 30 pages with meticulous handwriting, each one a record of the company's crimes. Transfers of prisoners, requests for medical restraints, orders to silence witnesses. It was all there, written in the cold, bureaucratic language of men who believed they were above the law. Caleb took the pages and folded them carefully, adding them to the documents already in his pocket. "What happens to me now?" Jessup asked, his voice hollow. "That's up to you," Caleb said. "You can stay here and wait for the company to figure out what you did, or you can disappear before they come looking." "Where would I go?" "That's not my problem." Jessup nodded slowly, then looked at Mara. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what it's worth." Mara's expression didn't change. "It's not worth much," she said. They left Jessup sitting at his desk, staring at the empty whiskey bottle, and walked out into the cold gray light of early morning. The town was just beginning to stir, smoke rising from chimneys, a rooster crowing somewhere down the street, the smell of bacon drifting from the boarding house kitchen. Caleb and Mara mounted their horses and rode out before anyone could see them, heading back toward the ranch with the weight of the evidence heavy in Caleb's pocket. "What now?" Mara asked as they crested the ridge. "Now we wait for Aldrich to reply, and we hope he gets here before the company figures out what we've done." But even as he said it, Caleb knew they were running out of time. The reply from Aldrich came 2 days later. Caleb had ridden back to Pine Bluff alone, leaving Mara at the ranch with strict instructions to stay hidden. The telegraph clerk handed him the folded message without comment, and Caleb read it standing in the middle of the dusty street, his heart pounding. Rourke, stop. Evidence you describe is extraordinary. Stop. I am departing Cheyenne today with Federal Judge Nathaniel Crow. Stop. Will arrive Stillwater Ridge in 4 days. Stop. Do not engage company until we arrive. Stop. Hold evidence secure. Stop. Aldrich. 4 days. Caleb folded the telegram and slid it into his pocket, then mounted his horse and rode hard for the ranch, pushing the gelding faster than he should have. 4 days wasn't much time, but it was enough. Enough to stay hidden. Enough to keep Mara safe, enough to prepare for whatever came next. But when he arrived at the ranch, something was wrong. The door to the cabin stood open, swinging slightly in the wind. The horses were gone from the corral, and Mara was nowhere to be seen. Caleb dismounted and pulled his rifle from the saddle, his pulse hammering in his ears. He moved toward the cabin slowly, every sense on high alert, and stepped inside. The interior had been torn apart. The table overturned, the stove pulled away from the wall, the mattress sliced open, its stuffing scattered across the floor. Someone had searched the place thoroughly, violently, looking for something, looking for the evidence. Caleb's chest tightened. They'd come for it. The company had figured out what he and Mara had done, and they'd come to destroy the proof before anyone could see it. But the evidence wasn't here. It was still in Caleb's pocket, safe and untouched, which meant they'd come for something else. A sound from outside made Caleb spin around, the rifle coming up, and he saw a figure standing in the doorway. Doherty. The tall man from before, the one who'd waited in Caleb's yard with threats and smiles. But he wasn't smiling now. His face was hard, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. "Looking for something, Rourke?" he said. Caleb's finger moved to the trigger. "Where's Mara?" "Safe. For now. Depends on what you do next." "What do you want?" Doherty took a step into the cabin, his boots crunching on broken glass. "The documents you stole from the telegraph office. The messages you copied. Hand them over, and maybe the girl walks away from this. And if I don't? Then she ends up in the canyon with your wife. And trust me, Rourke, you don't want that." Caleb's mind raced. If he gave Doherty the evidence, everything they'd risked would be for nothing. Eliza would stay locked in that camp. The 12 missing people would stay missing. And the company would keep doing whatever it wanted because no one could prove otherwise. But if he refused, Mara would die. "How do I know she's still alive?" Caleb asked. Doherty reached into his coat and pulled out a strip of brown cloth, the same cloth Mara had used to tie back her hair. He tossed it onto the floor at Caleb's feet. "Colonel Harrow sends his regards," Doherty said. "He's a patient man, but his patience has limits. You've got until sundown to bring those documents to the canyon. Come alone. No tricks, or the girl disappears just like the others." "And if I bring them?" "Then maybe you get to see your wife again before we decide what to do with you." Caleb stared at him, his hands steady on the rifle, but his mind screaming. "I'll be there," he said quietly. Doherty smiled. "Smart choice," he said. Then he turned and walked out, his boots echoing on the porch boards, and a moment later Caleb heard the sound of a horse galloping away. Caleb stood alone in the ruined cabin, the strip of brown cloth at his feet, and for the first time since this whole nightmare started, he felt the weight of it crushing down on him. He'd thought he could outsmart them. He'd thought gathering evidence would be enough, but the company didn't play by the rules. They never had. And now Mara was paying the price for trusting him. He picked up the cloth and held it in his hands, thinking. 4 days until Aldrich and the judge arrived. Sundown until Doherty's deadline. It wasn't enough time. But it would have to be. Caleb spent the rest of the morning preparing. He cleaned his rifle and checked his ammunition. He filled his canteen and packed enough food for a day's ride. And then he sat at the broken table and carefully divided the evidence into 2 piles. The first pile contained the most damning documents: the expired law, Harrow's messages about permanent resolutions, the records of illegal detentions. He wrapped these in oilcloth and hid them in a metal box that he buried under the floorboards near the stove. If something happened to him, if he didn't come back, someone would find them eventually. The second pile contained enough to look authentic. Real messages from the telegraph office, but carefully chosen to avoid the most incriminating details. He folded these and put them in his saddlebag. It wasn't much of a plan. It was barely even a plan at all. But it was all he had. He was about to leave when he heard hoofbeats outside. His hand moved to the rifle, but when he looked through the window, he saw a rider approaching alone, moving slowly, hands visible and empty. Caleb stepped outside, the rifle across his chest, and waited. The rider was a woman, middle-aged and sturdy, wearing a dark traveling coat and a wide-brimmed hat. She reined in her horse at the edge of the yard and looked at Caleb with sharp, intelligent eyes. "Caleb Rourke?" she said. "Who's asking?" "My name is Margaret Aldrich. I'm a clerk for my husband, the lawyer. He sent me ahead to make contact while he and Judge Crow gather additional support in Cheyenne." Caleb stared at her. "He said 4 days. He also said not to engage the company, but I'm guessing that ship has sailed." "How did you know?" Margaret dismounted and pulled a folded telegram from her coat pocket. "Your telegraph operator in Pine Bluff sent word this morning. Said armed men had been asking about you. Said there was talk in town that you'd stolen company documents and kidnapped a girl from the boarding house." "That's a lie. They took her. I figured as much, which is why I'm here. My husband wanted me to assess the situation before he brings a federal judge into what might be a war zone." Caleb let out a long breath, some of the tension draining from his shoulders. "The company has 2 hostages," he said, "my wife and a woman named Mara Doyle. They're holding them at a detention camp north of here. They want me to bring the evidence I've gathered in exchange for Mara's release, but I don't trust them to honor the deal." "You shouldn't. Men like Harrow don't make deals. They make examples." "Then what do I do?" Margaret tied her horse to the fence and walked closer, her expression serious. "You give me the real evidence. I'll ride to the nearest territorial marshal and file a formal complaint. With the documents you've gathered, we can force the marshal to act. He'll have no choice but to investigate." "That'll take days. Maybe weeks." "Maybe. But it's the only way to do this legally." Caleb shook his head. "I don't have days. They want the documents by sundown. If I don't show up, they'll kill Mara. Maybe Eliza too." Margaret studied him for a long moment, and Caleb saw something in her eyes. Understanding, maybe, or sympathy. "You're planning to go anyway, aren't you?" she said. "I don't have a choice." "Then at least give me the real evidence first. If something happens to you, your wife and that girl will still have a chance." Caleb hesitated, then nodded. He went back into the cabin and retrieved the metal box from under the floorboards. He opened it and handed Margaret the carefully wrapped documents. "Everything's here," he said. "The expired law. Harrow's messages. Records of illegal detentions. It's enough to bury them." Margaret took the bundle and slid it into her satchel. "What are you going to give them?" she asked. "Enough to make them think they've won, at least for a few hours. And then?" "Then I'm going to get my wife and Mara out of that camp, with or without the law's help." Margaret shook her head slowly. "You'll get yourself killed." "Probably, but I'm done waiting for permission to do what's right." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, then reached into her coat and pulled out a small Derringer pistol. She held it out to him. "Take it," she said. "It's not much, but it might buy you an extra second when you need it most." Caleb took the pistol and slid it into his boot. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet. Just stay alive long enough for the law to catch up." She mounted her horse and turned toward the road. But before she rode off, she looked back at him one more time. "Your wife must be something special," she said. "She is." "Then bring her home." And with that, Margaret Aldrich rode east toward the territorial marshal's office, carrying the only proof that could save them all, while Caleb Rourke turned his horse north toward the canyon and whatever waited for him there. The sun was already past its peak, sliding toward the western horizon. He had maybe 4 hours until sundown. 4 hours to ride into the lion's den with nothing but fake documents and a prayer that he could outthink men who'd been playing this game longer than he had. 4 hours to see Eliza again. He urged his horse forward, and as the ranch disappeared behind him, Caleb realized something that should have terrified him, but didn't. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was only afraid of failing. The canyon opened up before him like a wound in the earth. steep walls of rust-colored rock rising on either side of a narrow road that wound deeper into shadow. Caleb had ridden this direction once before, years ago, chasing a stray calf that had wandered too far from the herd. Back then, the canyon had been empty except for the ruins of an old smelter, abandoned when the silver played out, and the miners moved on to richer ground. Now it held something far more valuable than silver. It held the truth the company had been trying to bury. The sun hung low behind him, casting his shadow long across the dusty road. He'd made good time, pushing his horse harder than he should have, and now with maybe an hour of daylight left, he could see the camp ahead where the canyon widened into a flat basin surrounded by high walls of stone. A fence ran the perimeter, 10 feet tall and made of rough-cut timber topped with barbed wire. Watchtowers stood at two corners, crude platforms with canvas roofs where guards could see anyone approaching from half a mile away. They'd already seen him. Caleb could tell by the way one of them raised a rifle to track his movement, then lowered it when he kept coming at an easy pace, hands visible, no threat in his posture. The gate stood closed, heavy beams reinforced with iron straps, and two men flanked it with rifles cradled in their arms. Caleb recognized neither of them, but they had the look of company men. Hard faces, worn clothes, eyes that had seen enough violence to stop being surprised by it. He reined in 20 feet from the gate and waited. One of the guards stepped forward, his rifle pointed at the ground but ready to come up fast if needed. "State your business," the guard said. "Caleb Rourke. I'm here to see Colonel Harrow." The guard studied him for a moment, then nodded to his partner, who disappeared into a small building just inside the fence. Caleb sat on his horse, his heart beating steady and slow, his hands loose on the reins. He could feel the weight of the fake documents in his saddlebag and the derringer in his boot, but he kept his face neutral, his body relaxed. A few minutes later, the second guard returned and nodded. The gate swung open. Caleb rode through, and the sound of it closing behind him felt like a trap snapping shut. Inside the fence, the camp sprawled across the basin in a rough grid of buildings. Wooden barracks for the guards, a stable, a cookhouse with smoke rising from its chimney, and at the far end, the stone building Mara had described. Thick walls, barred windows, a heavy door with iron hinges. That's where they'd keep the prisoners. That's where Eliza would be. The guard gestured toward a building near the center of the camp, larger than the others, with a covered porch and a second story. Caleb dismounted and tied his horse to a post, then followed the guard up the steps and inside. The interior was dimly lit, furnished like a frontier office with a desk, chairs, and a map of the territory tacked to one wall. And standing by the window, his back to the door, was a man Caleb had never seen but recognized instantly from Mara's description. Colonel Victor Harrow. He was tall and lean, his left sleeve pinned up where his arm ended just below the shoulder. His hair was gray, cropped short, and his face had the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades in hard country. When he turned to face Caleb, his eyes were pale blue and cold as winter ice. "Mr. Rourke," Harrow said, his voice smooth and cultured at odds with his appearance. "Thank you for being punctual. I appreciate a man who understands the value of time." Caleb said nothing. Harrow gestured to a chair. "Sit, please." "I'd rather stand." "Suit yourself." Harrow moved to the desk and leaned against it, studying Caleb with the detached interest of a man examining an insect. "You've caused me considerable trouble in the past few days. Breaking into a telegraph office, stealing company documents, spreading lies about detention and kidnapping. I assume you understand the seriousness of these accusations." "They're not accusations," Caleb said. "They're facts." Harrow smiled faintly. "Facts are malleable things on the frontier, Mr. Rourke. What matters is who has the authority to define them, and in this territory, that authority belongs to Grantham and Vale. Not anymore." "No?" Harrow raised an eyebrow. "You think sending a telegram to some disgraced lawyer in Cheyenne gives you authority? You think stealing a few papers changes anything? I think the law you used to justify holding my wife expired 6 years ago. I think every person you've detained since then has been held illegally. And I think when a federal judge sees the evidence, your authority won't mean a damn thing." Harrow's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or respect for an opponent who'd done his homework. "You've been busy." Harrow said quietly. I underestimated you. I assumed you were just another grieving husband too broken to ask questions. I should have known better. Where's Mara? Safe, as promised. And your wife is alive as well, though I imagine you'd like to confirm that for yourself. I would. Harrow straightened and walked to the door, opening it and speaking to someone outside. A moment later, footsteps echoed in the hallway, and two guards appeared, dragging a woman between them. Caleb's breath caught in his throat. It was Eliza. She was thinner than he remembered, her face pale and drawn, her dark hair hanging loose around her shoulders. Her dress was torn and dirty, and there were bruises on her arms where the guards gripped her. But her eyes were still fierce, still burning with the same stubborn fire he'd fallen in love with 5 years ago. When she saw him, she stopped struggling, and for a moment they just stared at each other across the room. Caleb, she whispered. Eliza. Harrow gestured for the guards to bring her closer, and they shoved her into a chair. She winced, but didn't cry out, her jaw set, her hands clenched in her lap. There, Harrow said. Proof of life. Now, let's discuss the terms of her release. Caleb tore his eyes away from Eliza and looked at Harrow. You said if I brought the documents, you'd let Mara go. And I will, but first I need to see what you brought. Caleb reached into his saddlebag and pulled out the folded papers, the carefully selected messages that looked damning enough to seem real, but wouldn't actually destroy the company if they fell into the wrong hands. He held them out. Harrow took them and spent several minutes reading, his face impassive. When he finished, he set them on the desk and looked at Caleb with something close to amusement. These are copies, he said, not originals. They're all I have. That's a lie. Believe what you want. Harrow studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. It doesn't matter. Copies, originals, they're just paper, and paper burns. He picked up the documents and walked to the stove in the corner of the room. He opened the iron door, and flames licked out, hungry and bright. Then he tossed the papers inside and watched them curl and blacken and disappear into ash. Caleb's fists clenched at his sides, but he kept his face neutral. Now, Harrow said, turning back to him, let's talk about what happens next. You let them go, both of them. That was the deal. The deal was contingent on your cooperation, and I'm not convinced you've been entirely cooperative. I gave you what you asked for. You gave me copies of messages I already know exist. What I want is the original authorization document. The one the girl stole from the telegraph office almost a year ago. The one with my signature on it. Caleb's mind raced. The authorization was wrapped in oilcloth, buried under the floorboards at the ranch, now in Margaret Aldrich's possession and halfway to the territorial marshal by now. I don't have it, Caleb said. Then you have a problem. Harrow nodded to the guards, and one of them stepped forward and struck Eliza across the face with the back of his hand. Her head snapped to the side and blood appeared at the corner of her mouth. Caleb lunged forward, but the other guard moved fast, slamming the butt of his rifle into Caleb's stomach. He doubled over, gasping, and the guard shoved him back against the wall. Stop, Caleb choked out. Stop. Harrow walked over to Eliza and lifted her chin with one finger, forcing her to look at him. Your husband is trying to protect you, he said softly. But he's doing it the wrong way. Tell him to give me the document, and this all ends. Eliza's eyes blazed. She spat blood onto the floor and looked past Harrow to Caleb. Don't give him anything, she said, her voice steady despite the blood on her lips. He's going to kill us no matter what you do. Harrow sighed and stepped back. Such a stubborn woman. I can see why you married her, Rourke. But stubbornness only gets you so far on the frontier. Eventually, it gets you killed. He turned to the guards. Take her back to her cell. And bring the other one. The guards dragged Eliza toward the door, and Caleb tried to move after her, but the rifle butt cracked against his ribs and drove him to his knees. He watched helplessly as they pulled her out into the hallway, her eyes locked on his until the door closed between them. A few minutes later, the door opened again, and the guards returned with Mara. She looked worse than Eliza. Her face was bruised, her dress torn, and she walked with a limp that suggested something had been broken and badly set. But when she saw Caleb, relief flooded her features. You came, she said. Of course I came. Harrow gestured for the guards to put Mara in the chair Eliza had vacated, and they did, though more gently than they'd handled Eliza. Mara sat down heavily, her breathing labored. "Now," Harrow said, looking between them. "Let's try this again. Where is the original authorization document?" Caleb met Mara's eyes, and he saw the same calculation there that he felt in his own chest. If they told Harrow the truth, that the document was already in the hands of a federal agent, he'd have no reason to keep them alive. But if they lied and he found out, he'd kill them anyway. "I buried it," Caleb said, "under the floorboards at my ranch." Harrow raised an eyebrow. "Then I'll send men to retrieve it. They won't find it without me. The cabin's been torn apart. They'd have to dig up every board in the place." "So you'll tell me exactly where it is?" "No, I'll take you there, tomorrow, after you let Mara go." Harrow laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "You're in no position to negotiate, Rourke. Neither are you. If you kill me, you'll never find that document, and when the federal judge arrives in 2 days, he's going to start asking questions you won't be able to answer." Harrow's smile faded. "What judge?" "Nathaniel Crow. He's writing from Cheyenne with a lawyer named Aldrich. They'll be here by the end of the week." For the first time since Caleb had entered the room, Harrow looked genuinely concerned. He walked to the window and stared out at the darkening canyon, his jaw tight. "You're bluffing," he said. "Am I? Ask your telegraph operator. Ask Doherty. They both know I sent a message to Aldrich. You think I'd do that if I didn't expect him to act on it?" Harrow turned back, his eyes hard. "If a federal judge comes here, he'll find nothing. This is private property. A medical facility for individuals who've suffered mental distress due to land disputes. Everything we've done is legal and documented. Except the law you're using expired 6 years ago." Harrow went very still. "You can't prove that." "I already did. It's in the papers I gave you, or it was before you burned them." Harrow's face darkened, and for a moment Caleb thought the man might shoot him right there, but instead Harrow walked to the desk and pulled out a pistol, checking its load with practiced efficiency. "Lock them both in the detention building," he said to the guards. "Together. I want them under constant watch. If either of them tries to escape, shoot them." The guards nodded and hauled Caleb and Mara to their feet. As they were dragged toward the door, Caleb looked back at Harrow. "You can't bury this forever," he said. Harrow met his eyes, and for a moment there was something almost like respect in his gaze. "No," he said quietly, "but I can bury it long enough." The detention building was exactly as Mara had described it. Stone walls, barred windows, a heavy door that clanged shut with the finality of a coffin lid. Inside, a narrow hallway ran the length of the building, with cells on either side, each one barely big enough for a single cot and a slop bucket. The guards shoved Caleb and Mara into a cell at the far end and locked the door behind them. Through the bars, Caleb could see other cells, some empty, some occupied by shadowy figures who didn't move or speak. The 12 missing people. Or what was left of them. Mara sank onto the cot, her face pale, her hands shaking. Caleb knelt beside her and examined the bruises on her face, the way she favored her left side. "How bad is it?" he asked. "Ribs. Maybe broken. Hard to tell. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have left you alone at the ranch. You didn't know they'd come." "I should have expected it." Mara looked at him, and despite the pain in her eyes, she managed a faint smile. "You came for me anyway. That's more than anyone else has ever done." Before Caleb could respond, a voice spoke from the cell across the hallway. "Caleb?" He turned. Eliza stood at the bars of her cell, her hands gripping the iron, her face illuminated by the faint light coming through the high window. "Eliza," he said, moving to the bars of his own cell so he could see her better. They stood there, separated by 10 feet of empty space and iron bars, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. There was too much to say, and no good way to say it. Finally, Eliza broke the silence. "You shouldn't have come," she said quietly. "I had to. They're going to kill you. Kill all of us. Not if the judge gets here first. You really think he's coming?" "I know he is. I sent the evidence with Aldrich's wife. By now it's in the hands of the territorial marshal. They'll have to investigate." Eliza closed her eyes, and Caleb saw her shoulders sag with something that might have been relief or might have been exhaustion too deep to measure. I tried to warn you, she said, before the flood. I tried to leave a message, but they found me before I could finish it. What message? The company's been stealing land for years, forging deeds, bribing surveyors, forcing families off their homesteads. I had proof. Documents from a man named Pritchard who worked for them and wanted out. I was going to take it to the territorial governor. What happened? The night before I planned to leave, the flood came. I thought I could make it across the bridge, but the current was too strong. I got swept downstream and I thought I was going to drown. Then I felt hands on me, pulling me out. I thought someone was saving me. Her voice broke and she had to stop for a moment. They weren't saving me, she whispered. They were taking me. Caleb's hands tightened on the bars. I woke up here, Eliza continued, in this cell. Harrow came every day for weeks asking me questions. Who did I tell? Where are the documents? Who else knows? I didn't tell him anything. I knew if I did, he'd have no reason to keep me alive. The documents are safe. Pritchard's evidence? Hidden. I gave them to someone I trusted before I tried to leave town. I don't know if they're still there, but Harrow never found them. Who did you give them to? Eliza looked past him to where Mara sat on the cot, quiet and still. Her, Eliza said softly. Caleb turned and Mara looked up, her eyes meeting his. You knew Eliza before the flood? He said. Mara nodded slowly. She came to the boarding house twice, the first time to meet Pritchard, the second time to ask me to hide something for her. She said if anything happened to her, I should get the documents to someone who could use them. I didn't know what they were. I just knew they were important. Where are they? In the boarding house, sewn into the lining of my mattress. Caleb stared at her, and suddenly everything clicked into place. The reason Mara had been watching the company for 11 months. The reason she'd risked everything to tell him the truth. She'd been protecting Eliza's evidence this whole time, waiting for someone to come along who could actually use it. You've been carrying that secret for almost a year, Caleb said. I didn't know what else to do. I couldn't go to the sheriff. I couldn't go to the law. So I just waited and watched and hoped someone would start asking the right questions. And then I did. Yes. Caleb looked back at Eliza, and for the first time since he'd walked into this camp, he felt something close to hope. If we can get out of here, he said, we can get those documents, combine them with what Margaret Aldrich is already carrying, and we'll have everything we need to destroy the company. That's a big if, Eliza said. I know, but it's all we've got. From somewhere outside, a bell rang, deep and slow, signaling the change of the guard. Footsteps echoed in the hallway as the night shift took over, and through the high window Caleb could see the last light fading from the sky. They had maybe 12 hours until dawn. 12 hours to figure out how to escape from a locked cell in the middle of an armed camp surrounded by high fences and guards who'd been ordered to shoot them on sight. Caleb sat down on the floor, his back against the stone wall, and closed his eyes. His ribs ached where the rifle butt had hit him, and his hands were scraped and raw from gripping the bars. But his mind was clear, running through possibilities, discarding bad ideas, looking for the one weakness in Harrow's defenses. Across the hallway, Eliza sat down on her own cot, and in the dim light Caleb could see her watching him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else he couldn't quite name. Trust, maybe, or faith that somehow, against all odds, he'd find a way to get them out of this. Caleb, she said quietly. Yeah? I never stopped believing you'd come. His throat tightened. I never stopped looking. I know. And in that moment, separated by iron and stone and a year of silence, they were together again. Not the way they'd been before the flood. That was gone. Broken beyond repair by everything that had happened, but in a new way, forged by loss and hardship and the simple stubborn refusal to give up on each other even when the world said they should. Mara spoke from the shadows behind him, her voice barely more than a whisper. What do we do now? Caleb opened his eyes and looked at the barred door, at the guards pacing outside, at the high window where the stars were just beginning to appear. We wait, he said, and we watch. And when the moment comes, we move. What moment? I don't know yet, but it'll come. It always does. And so they waited, 3 prisoners in a stone cell at the edge of the frontier, surrounded by enemies and locked behind iron bars. betting everything on the hope that somewhere out there, the law was finally coming to balance the scales. The night dragged on with the weight of centuries. Caleb sat against the cold stone wall, listening to the guards change shifts every few hours, their boots echoing down the hallway in rhythmic patterns he committed to memory. 2 men at night, 3 during the day, one always stationed at the main door, the others patrolling the cells. Across the hallway, Eliza had fallen into an uneasy sleep, curled on her side on the narrow cot. Mara dozed beside him, her breathing shallow and pained. Caleb didn't sleep. His mind kept turning over the problem, searching for the weakness, the crack in Harrow's armor. The moment came just before dawn. One of the night guards, a younger man Caleb had heard the others call Hayes, stopped at their cell with a tin cup of water. He slid it through the gap under the door, and as he did, Caleb saw something the others had missed. Hayes was scared. It showed in the way his hands trembled slightly as he set down the cup, in the way his eyes darted toward the main door like he expected someone to catch him showing mercy, in the way he lingered just a second too long, his gaze moving from Caleb to Mara's bruised face. "Thank you," Caleb said quietly. Hayes flinched at the sound of his voice, then nodded once and moved away quickly. But that hesitation told Caleb everything he needed to know. Not all of Harrow's men were true believers. Some of them were just trying to survive. When Hayes made his next round an hour later, Caleb was waiting at the bars. "You're not like the others," Caleb said, keeping his voice low enough that only Hayes could hear. The guard stopped, his hand moving instinctively to his pistol. "Don't talk to me," he said. "How long have you worked for Harrow?" "I said don't talk to me." 6 months? A year? Long enough to know what he does to people who ask the wrong questions. Hayes' jaw tightened, but he didn't walk away. "You don't know anything about me," he said. "I know you brought us water when you didn't have to. I know you looked at that girl's face and felt something. That's more humanity than the others have shown. Feeling something doesn't change anything. I've got a job to do. Even if that job means helping a man who kidnaps innocent people and buries them in this canyon." Hayes glanced toward the main door, checking to make sure the other guard wasn't listening. "Those aren't innocent people," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "They broke the law. They stole company property." "What law? The one that expired 6 years ago?" Hayes went very still. "Harrow told you that?" Caleb pressed. "Or did he just tell you to follow orders and not ask questions?" There's a federal judge riding here from Cheyenne. He'll be here in 2 days, maybe less. When he arrives, he's going to ask every man in this camp what they knew and when they knew it. The ones who helped Harrow willingly are going to hang, but the ones who were just following orders, the ones who showed mercy when they could, they might have a chance." Hayes' face had gone pale. "You're lying. Ask yourself why Harrow's been so nervous the past few days. Ask yourself why he's suddenly desperate to find documents he burned months ago. The walls are closing in, and he knows it." Hayes stared at him for a long moment, and Caleb could see the conflict playing out behind his eyes. Fear versus conscience. Survival versus doing what was right. Finally, Hayes stepped closer to the bars. "Even if I wanted to help you," he whispered, "I can't. Harrow's got eyes everywhere. If I let you out, he'd know. He'd hunt me down before I made it 10 miles. What if you didn't have to let us out? What if all you had to do was look the other way for 5 minutes? Look the other way when? When the judge arrives. When everything goes to hell. When Harrow realizes he's lost and starts trying to cover his tracks by killing witnesses." Hayes swallowed hard. He already ordered your men to shoot us if we tried to escape. You think he's planning to let any of us testify when the law comes asking questions?" The truth of it settled over Hayes like a shroud. He stepped back from the bars, his face ashen. "I can't help you," he said, but the words sounded hollow. "You already have," Caleb said, "just by listening." Hayes turned and walked away without another word, but Caleb saw the seed had been planted. All he could do now was hope it would grow fast enough to matter. Dawn came gray and cold, filtered through the high windows in thin shafts of light that barely touched the stone floor. The day shift arrived with the smell of coffee and bacon, and Caleb's stomach growled despite everything. They hadn't been fed since he'd arrived, and hunger was starting to gnaw at the edges of his focus. A guard he didn't recognize brought tin plates of food, hard biscuits and salt pork that looked like it had been cooked days ago. The guard shoved the plates under the door without a word, and Caleb divided his portion with Mara, who ate mechanically, her eyes distant. Across the hallway, Eliza sat up and took her own plate, but she didn't eat. She just stared at the food like she'd forgotten what it was for. "You need to eat," Caleb said. She looked up at him, and he saw how much the months of captivity had taken from her. Not just physically, though she was thinner than he'd ever seen her, but something deeper, some essential spark that had been dimmed by too many days in this cell, too many interrogations, too many nights wondering if anyone would ever come. "What's the point?" she said quietly. "The point is we're getting out of here." "How?" "You saw how many guards there are. You saw the fence, the watchtowers. Even if we could get out of this cell, we'd never make it past the gate." "We don't need to make it past the gate. We just need to survive until the judge arrives." "And if he doesn't come?" Caleb met her eyes, and he saw the question beneath the question, the doubt that had taken root during 11 months of darkness and silence. "He's coming," Caleb said. "I promise you, Eliza, the law is coming, and when it does, Harrow's going to answer for everything he's done." Eliza held his gaze for a moment longer, then looked away. "I want to believe you," she said. "Then believe me." She picked up the biscuit and took a small bite, and Caleb felt something loosen in his chest. They sat in silence for a while, eating what they could stomach, and then Mara spoke from beside him. "What if Harrow runs?" she said. "What if he realizes the judge is coming and just disappears before anyone can arrest him?" "He won't," Caleb said. "How do you know?" "Because men like Harrow don't run. They double down. They convince themselves they're untouchable right up until the moment the walls come down around them. And what happens to us in the meantime?" That was the question Caleb didn't have a good answer for. Because Mara was right. If Harrow decided to cut his losses and eliminate the witnesses, there wouldn't be anything Caleb could do to stop him, unless the moment he'd been waiting for came first. It came at noon. Caleb heard the commotion before he saw it. Raised voices outside the detention building, the sound of horses arriving at a gallop, boots pounding across the yard. He moved to the barred window and pulled himself up just high enough to see out. Riders. At least a dozen of them coming through the gate in a cloud of dust. And at the front, wearing a black coat and a silver badge that caught the sunlight, rode a man Caleb had never seen but recognized from Margaret Aldrich's description. Federal Judge Nathaniel Crow. He'd come early. Caleb dropped back down and turned to Eliza. "They're here," he said. Hope flared in her eyes, bright and sudden, and across the cell Mara grabbed the bars and pulled herself to the window to see for herself. Outside, Harrow emerged from his office, flanked by Doherty and two other armed men. He walked across the yard to meet the judge, his movements controlled but his body language screaming tension. Caleb couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could read the scene well enough. Crow was demanding access to the detention building. Harrow was refusing, citing private property and lack of jurisdiction. The two men stood toe-to-toe, neither backing down, while the deputies and company guards watched with hands hovering near their weapons. Then Crow pulled a folded document from his coat and held it up for Harrow to see. Even from this distance, Caleb could see the official seal stamped at the bottom. A federal warrant. Harrow's face went rigid. He said something sharp to Doherty, who turned and started barking orders to the guards. Men scattered across the yard, some running toward the barracks, others taking up defensive positions near the fence. They were preparing for a fight. "Get down from the window," Caleb said to Mara. "Now!" She dropped down just as the first gunshot cracked across the yard. Caleb couldn't see who fired first, but it didn't matter. The camp erupted into chaos, guards shooting at deputies, deputies returning fire, men diving for cover behind buildings and water troughs. Through the window, Caleb saw Judge Crow's horse rear and bolt, and the judge himself disappeared behind the cookhouse. More gunfire, shouting, the sound of breaking glass, and then footsteps in the hallway outside their cell. The door to the detention building slammed open, and Hayes burst through, his face pale and slick with sweat. He had a ring of keys in one hand and a pistol in the other. "Get back," he said, fumbling with the keys. Caleb didn't argue. He pulled Mara behind him as Hayes unlocked the cell door and swung it open. "You've got maybe 5 minutes before Harrow realizes what I've done," Hayes said, tossing Caleb the pistol. There's a break in the fence on the north side behind the old smelter. You can slip through if you're fast. What about the others? Caleb said, gesturing to the occupied cells down the hallway. I'll get them. You just go. Caleb grabbed Hayes' arm. Thank you. Hayes nodded once, then moved down the hallway to unlock Eliza's cell. Caleb helped Mara toward the door, supporting her weight as her injured ribs made every step an agony. Behind them, he heard Eliza's cell open, heard her gasp of relief, and then she was there beside him, thin and pale, but alive. They stumbled out into the chaos of the yard together. The gunfight was still raging, bullets kicking up dust and punching holes through wooden walls. Caleb saw a deputy go down, clutching his leg, and another guard fall from the watchtower with a scream. Judge Crow had taken cover behind a wagon and was shouting orders to his men, trying to establish some kind of order in the madness. Caleb pulled Eliza and Mara toward the north side of the camp, staying low, moving between buildings to avoid the worst of the crossfire. They were halfway to the smelter when a voice stopped them cold. "Rourke!" Caleb turned. Harrow stood 20 feet away, his pistol drawn, his face twisted with rage. Behind him, the camp burned, smoke rising from the cookhouse where a stray bullet had ignited the woodpile, flames beginning to spread. "You think this changes anything?" Harrow said. "You think a federal warrant means the law can touch me?" "It's over, Harrow," Caleb said. "Let us go." "Nothing's over until I say it is." Harrow raised his pistol, and for a moment Caleb thought he was going to fire. But then another voice cut through the chaos. "Colonel Harrow!" Judge Crow stepped out from behind the wagon, his own weapon drawn, flanked by 3 deputies. "You're under arrest," Crow said, his voice carrying across the yard despite the gunfire, "for kidnapping, illegal detention, and conspiracy to defraud settlers of their land rights. Drop your weapon." Harrow didn't move. He kept the pistol trained on Caleb, his finger tight on the trigger. "This is my territory," Harrow said. "My land. My law." "Not anymore," Crow said. For a long moment, everything hung in balance. The shooting had stopped, both sides watching to see what Harrow would do. The fire crackled and spread, eating through the cookhouse and reaching toward the barracks. Smoke filled the air, thick and choking. Then Harrow smiled, a cold, empty expression. "If I can't have it," he said quietly, "no one can." He swung his pistol toward Eliza. Caleb moved without thinking. He raised the pistol Hayes had given him and fired. The shot caught Harrow in the shoulder, spinning him around. His own weapon discharged into the dirt, and he staggered backward, clutching the wound. Before he could recover, 2 deputies were on him, wrestling him to the ground and pinning his arms behind his back. Caleb's hand shook as he lowered the pistol. He'd never shot a man before, never even pointed a gun at another human being. But watching Harrow struggle against the deputies, seeing the blood seep through his fingers, Caleb felt nothing but cold satisfaction. Judge Crow walked over, his face grim. "Mr. Rourke, I presume?" "Yes, sir." "Margaret Aldrich told me you'd be here. She said you had evidence." "I did. Harrow burned it." "The copies, maybe, but we recovered the originals from Mrs. Aldrich, along with additional documents from a surveyor named Pritchard." Crow looked past Caleb to where Eliza stood, supported by Mara. "I'm guessing you're the one who secured those." Eliza nodded, too exhausted to speak. "Then you've done this territory a great service," Crow said. "Both of you." He turned and gestured to his deputies. "Secure the colonel. Get medical attention for the wounded. And someone put out that fire before it burns down the whole damn camp." The deputies moved to obey, and within minutes the chaos began to resolve into order. The company guards who'd surrendered were being disarmed and lined up against the fence. The prisoners from the detention building were emerging into the daylight, blinking and disoriented, Hayes guiding them with gentle hands. Caleb saw men and women he recognized from Mara's list. Not all 12, some were missing, their fates unknown, but enough to prove the company's crimes. Enough to bring justice. Eliza leaned against him and he wrapped his arm around her shoulders, feeling the sharp angles of her bones, the way she trembled despite the warmth of the day. "It's over," he said softly. She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face. "Is it? Really?" "Yeah, it's really over." And for the first time in 11 months, Caleb believed it. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of testimony and paperwork. Judge Crow set up a temporary court in Stillwater Ridge. And for a week the town hall was filled with witnesses, lawyers, and deputies taking statements. Caleb testified about finding Mara in the churchyard, about the documents they'd uncovered, about the night he'd ridden into the canyon to trade himself for Eliza's freedom. Eliza testified about Pritchard's evidence, about the months of interrogation, about the 12 names she'd memorized from overheard conversations. Mara testified about the patterns she'd noticed, about the authorization she'd stolen, about hiding Eliza's documents for nearly a year while waiting for someone to listen. And one by one, the other prisoners testified too. Stories of land stolen, families threatened, disappearances that had never been investigated because no one with power had cared enough to ask questions. The evidence was overwhelming. By the end of the week, Judge Crow had issued warrants for 24 company officials, from Harrow all the way up to the executives in Denver who'd known about the detention camp and approved its funding. Harrow himself was held in the town jail, his shoulder bandaged, his face empty of the arrogance he'd worn in the canyon. Dougherty and 3 other guards were held with him, facing charges of kidnapping and assault. The rest of the company's men had scattered to the wind, disappearing into the frontier before the law could catch them. Caleb didn't care about the ones who got away. What mattered was that the system had collapsed, that the secret was out, that no one else would vanish into that canyon and be forgotten. On the 8th day, Margaret Aldrich arrived with her husband, a sharp-eyed man in a worn suit who immediately began organizing the legal proceedings with the efficiency of someone who'd been preparing for this fight for years. He met with Eliza privately, reviewing Pritchard's documents, and when he emerged from the meeting, his expression was grim but determined. "This goes deeper than Grantham and Vale," he told Judge Crow. "The land fraud extends to at least 4 other companies operating in the territory. We're looking at hundreds of fraudulent claims, millions of acres stolen from legitimate settlers." "Then we expand the investigation," Crow said simply. "However long it takes." Caleb stood in the back of the town hall, listening to them plan the next phase, and he felt a strange sense of disconnection. The fight he'd started seemed to be growing beyond anything he'd imagined. What had begun as one man searching for his missing wife had become a reckoning for an entire territory, but his part in it was finished. Eliza found him that evening, standing outside the boarding house where Mara had returned to reclaim her old room and the documents still sewn into her mattress. The sun was setting, painting the hills in shades of gold and copper, and the air smelled like sage and approaching autumn. "You're quiet," Eliza said. "Just thinking." "About what?" Caleb looked at her. She'd gained a little weight in the past week, and the bruises on her face were fading to yellow, but there were still shadows in her eyes, still a wariness in the way she held herself, like she was waiting for someone to grab her and drag her back to that cell. "About what comes next," he said. "We go home. We rebuild. We figure out how to live again." "Is that what you want?" Eliza was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "I don't know what I want yet. I spent 11 months in that place thinking I'd never see you again, never see daylight, never have a choice about anything. Now I have choices, and I don't know what to do with them." "Take your time," Caleb said. "We've got nothing but time now." She reached out and took his hand, and they stood there together, watching the sun disappear behind the ridge. "I'm not the same person you married," Eliza said after a while. "Neither am I. Can we still make this work?" Caleb squeezed her hand gently. "I don't know, but I'd like to try." She leaned against him, and he wrapped his arm around her, and for the first time since the flood, they stood together without iron bars or stone walls between them. It wasn't the reunion Caleb had imagined during those 11 months of standing at her grave. There were no dramatic declarations, no perfect moments of healing, just 2 broken people trying to figure out how to fit back together after everything they'd survived. But it was enough. It was a start. 3 weeks later, Caleb and Eliza returned to the ranch. The cabin had been cleaned up by neighbors who'd heard what happened and wanted to help. The broken furniture had been repaired or replaced. The torn mattress had been sewn back together. Fresh supplies filled the shelves, and someone had even brought over a crate of chickens to replace the ones that had wandered off during Caleb's absence. Mara came with them. She'd nowhere else to go. The boarding house had shut down after the owner was arrested for accepting bribes from the company, and Eliza had insisted she stay until she figured out what came next. "You saved my life," Eliza had said. The least I can do is give you a place to sleep while you decide what to do with yours." So Mara took the small room off the kitchen, the one Caleb had been planning to turn into a nursery before Eliza disappeared. She kept to herself mostly, reading books borrowed from the town library, helping with chores when her ribs allowed, slowly healing from the physical wounds even as the deeper ones remained. The three of them settled into a quiet routine. Caleb worked the ranch, repairing fences and bringing in the late hay. Eliza tended the garden and learned how to sleep through the night without waking in a panic. Mara cooked meals and wrote letters to Judge Crow, answering questions about the case, providing details no one else remembered. It wasn't perfect. Some days Eliza couldn't get out of bed, the weight of everything pressing down on her until she could barely breathe. Some nights Caleb woke to find her standing at the window, staring out at the darkness like she expected armed men to come riding out of it. And Mara still flinched at loud noises, still went quiet when strangers came to the ranch, still carried herself like someone waiting to be forgotten again. But slowly, day by day, they healed. News of the trial reached them through the weekly newspaper. Harrow had been convicted of kidnapping and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Dougherty and the other guards received shorter sentences in exchange for testimony against the company executives. And Grantham and Vale itself had been dissolved, its assets seized to compensate the families who'd lost land to fraudulent claims. 7 of the missing 12 were found alive, held in facilities across the territory. The other 5 were never accounted for, their fates lost to the same darkness that had nearly swallowed Eliza. The frontier had taken them, and the frontier rarely gave anything back. But for those who survived, there was justice. Slow and imperfect, but real. One cold morning in late November, Caleb stood in the churchyard where this whole thing had started, looking down at the grave marker that still bore Eliza's name. He'd thought about removing it, but Eliza had asked him to leave it. "It's a reminder," she'd said, "of what we lost and what we found." Mara appeared beside him, her coat pulled tight against the wind. "Strange, isn't it," she said, "that it all started here?" "Yeah. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't come to find you that day?" Caleb thought about it, about the silence he'd been living in, about the empty grave and the unanswered questions. "You'd still be invisible," he said, "and I'd still be standing here every Sunday, mourning a woman who wasn't dead." Mara smiled faintly. "Well, at least something good came out of all this suffering." "What's that?" "People finally see me," and it was true. In the weeks since the trial, Mara had received letters from across the territory, families thanking her for her testimony, lawyers asking for her help with similar cases, even a few marriage proposals from men who admired her courage. She'd turned them all down politely, but Caleb could see the change in her. The way she held herself straighter now. The way she met people's eyes instead of looking at the floor. The world had finally noticed Mara Doyle, and she'd decided she liked being seen. "What are you going to do?" Caleb asked. "Long term, I mean." "Judge Crow offered me a job, said he needs someone who knows how to dig through records and find patterns, someone who understands how powerful people hide their crimes." "You'd be good at that." "I think so too." She paused. "But I wanted to ask you and Eliza first. If you need me to stay—" "We'll be fine," Caleb said gently. "You've done more than enough for us. It's time you did something for yourself." Mara nodded, and Caleb saw relief in her eyes, mixed with something that might have been gratitude or might have been sadness at leaving the only real family she'd ever known. They stood together in the churchyard for a few more minutes, watching the wind move through the grass, and then they walked back to the ranch together, side by side, 2 people who'd found each other in the darkness and helped each other find the light. Spring came to the Wyoming frontier the way it always did, slowly, grudgingly, like the land itself wasn't sure it was ready to let go of winter. But eventually, the snow melted and the grass turned green and the first wildflowers appeared in the meadow behind the ranch. Eliza planted a garden bigger than they needed, working the soil with her hands, finding peace in the simple act of making things grow. Caleb rebuilt the corral and bought 3 new horses to replace the ones that had been lost. And together, slowly, they learned how to talk to each other again. Not about the flood or the canyon or the months of separation. Those wounds were still too raw, too deep to touch without bleeding. But about small things. What to plant? Where to put the fence? whether to keep chickens or try their hand at pigs, building a future one conversation at a time. Mara left in April, riding east with a letter of introduction from Judge Crow and enough money to get her started in her new life. Eliza hugged her goodbye on the porch, and Caleb saw tears in both their eyes. "You're always welcome here," Eliza said. "No matter what happens, this is your home too." "I know," Mara said, "and that means more than you'll ever understand." She mounted her horse and rode away without looking back, and Caleb stood beside Eliza, watching until Mara disappeared over the ridge. "She's going to do great things," Eliza said quietly. "Yeah, she is." They went back inside, and that evening they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the hills, and Caleb realized something that should have been obvious, but somehow felt like a revelation. They'd survived. Not unchanged, not unbroken, but alive. And on the frontier, where the land took more than it gave and justice moved slower than the seasons, survival was its own kind of victory. Quiet, unglamorous, but real. Eliza reached over and took his hand, and they sat there together as the stars began to appear. Two people who'd been tested by fire and darkness and had somehow found their way back to each other. The grave in the churchyard still stood, a reminder of what they'd lost and what they'd found. But they didn't visit it anymore. They didn't need to. Because the woman it had been built for was here, sitting beside the man who'd never stopped believing she would come home. And somewhere out there in the vast Wyoming territory, a forgotten woman who'd spent years being invisible was finally making her mark on the world, carrying forward the truth that she and Caleb and Eliza had fought so hard to uncover. The frontier rarely gave back what it took. But sometimes, if you refused to stop fighting, if you held on to hope even when it seemed foolish, if you listened to the quiet voices the world had learned to ignore, sometimes you got a second chance. Not perfect, not easy, but enough. And on the harsh Wyoming frontier, where survival itself was an act of defiance, enough was all anyone could ask for. The wind moved through the valley, carrying the scent of sage and new grass, and in the small ranch house at the edge of the territory, two people who'd been lost found their way home at last. 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 Their way home at last.